Hello, everyone. Today we are talking about the behaviorist approach in the major approaches of psychological study. So, as we mentioned a little bit before in our history of psychology, there are two major founders that we link to the behaviorist approach. John Watson, who is a pioneer in adding classical conditioning procedures to human behavior, and B.F. Skinner, who will essentially talk about how we can create behaviors that maybe aren't already naturally occurring behaviors. And we will talk a lot about both of them more as we continue to explore the behaviorist approach in later units. So the first thing we need to pay attention to when we look at the bottom line is it's different now. So all the other approaches, we start the bottom line as all behaviors and mental processes occur because of something and that's unique to that point of view. For the behaviorist approach, I want to remind us of the history that led to the behaviorist approach. And that is in the time period of those early 1900s, the rest of the scientific fields were really starting to hone in on those empirical methods. And in the midst of all that, you have psychology that is starting to look at people like the unconscious, or the psychodynamic approach and the unconscious and things that we can't empirically verify. Where we talked in the previous video about the id and the superego and the ego, those are great constructs for us to talk about, but we can never scientifically say for sure that there's an id or a superego. And so the behaviorist approach was created in response to that to try to be taken seriously as a science. And so the overall understanding of the behaviorist approach is mental processes are not scientifically measurable. And that is disputed among a lot of modern psychologists as well. But in the time, they can't read into the brain in the same level that we can now. And they know if I ask you what you're thinking about, you could tell me the truth, or you could make up any other random thing to tell me. And so the only thing we can say for sure in a scientific methodology is you have engaged in a behavior. You did this, and therefore that's measurable for me. And so when we look at the bottom line, we have scratched out mental processes. The same way that when John Watson became the president of the American Psychological Association, he cut mental processes out of the definition of psychology and called it the scientific study of behaviors. So when we consider from this point of view, we have to strike any form of mental processes away from our thinking. So that can be challenging. That means that any time that we're explaining a behavior and you try to add in this person wants something, or they think this will happen, or they expect this to happen, that's all incorrect, because we're not dealing with mental processes. And think and want and expect are all mental process words. So the only way that we actually can explain behaviors that are occurring now are what happened in your past when you engaged in behaviors. And when we really break it down to as simple as it can be, anytime you've engaged in any behavior in your life, one of three things has happened. So think about this for a second. Let's say you engaged in choose whatever behavior you want to. You decided to go for a walk. And when you went for a walk, one of three things happened. You were reinforced in some way. So reinforcements, when those happen, will lead you to perform that behavior more frequently. And so that's one example of a result for your past behavior, is the behavior is reinforced, which makes the behavior happen more. Maybe, and that reinforcement can look differently for a lot of different people. So maybe that reinforcement was you came home and your heart rate lowered. I can measure that. Maybe that reinforcement was when you came home, someone gave you a cookie. Maybe when you had a headache and you went walking and then the headache went away. That still counts as a reinforcement, because next time you get a headache, you're more likely to go on that walk again. Maybe on the other hand, maybe it was punished. And it's another result of your past behavior, could be a punishment, in which case whatever that punishment was, it's going to make you do that behavior less frequently. So if you went for that walk and you came back and your muscles really hurt, you might not walk as much. If you tripped and broke your ankle, you might choose not to go for a walk again. If you came home and someone like yelled at you, you might not go walk again. There is an important little catch to think about when we talk about your past behaviors. We don't really care if we think we're rewarding or if we think we're punishing. What matters is what is the resulting behavior that happens. So if you go for a walk and someone comes back and gives you a cookie and therefore you don't go on walks anymore, that cookie counts as a punishment because it kept you from going on walks in the future. And so the outcomes are what we're worried about. You did a behavior in the past, something happened, and that something influenced if you do it more or do it less in the future. Now, the third thing that could happen there is when you engage in a behavior, the behavior is ignored. So maybe you don't see anything happen. And so if you increase your behavior, then maybe there's a reinforcement we can't see. Maybe there's a mental process underlined, but with that mental process, I don't know what it is, so I can't scientifically measure it. And so therefore, we're going to call that an ignored behavior. So when those things when those past behaviors continue to get reinforced, they happen more. And so those behaviors that you do on a regular basis, you do that because they've been reinforced in the past. If there's a behavior you haven't done very much, there was a punishment factor involved there that kept you from engaging in those behaviors anymore. So one of the other extensions we can start to see when we talk about the behavior's point of view is think about animal training. With animal training, we can't talk about, there's this language barrier where we can't directly communicate with the animal a lot of times. But we know if I'm trying to train my dog to do a behavior, I'm going to reinforce the behaviors I want, and they're going to do those behaviors more. If I say sit and I give the dog a treat when they actually sit, I'm reinforcing the behavior of sitting. So, and that can go much more complex. If you've ever seen an animal show anywhere, it's the same principles that are involved here. Those are very reliant on the behaviorist approach. So, just to really extend on this, I always think it's worth bringing up Watson's quote. And for my AP students, you should know that sometimes the AP test is designed where they give you a very prominent quote and expect you to know, like, who was this guy? So this is probably one of the most famous quotes in psychology that's on your screen, where John Watson claims that if you could give him a dozen healthy infants and assuming that they were all healthy, and he uses the phrase well-formed, he could literally control their environment and create them into anything he wanted. So if we chose that we wanted to turn them into an artist, then if we completely control their environment, if they start doing artistic types of behaviors, you make sure you reinforce those a lot. And if they start doing anything else, then you ensure that those are always ignored or punished, until eventually the behaviors that repeat over and over and over again are artistic behaviors, and now you have yourselves an artist. Now, of course, there's all kinds of ethical violations to ever make that happen in real life, but it's an interesting thought experiment, and the fact that Watson believes that shows how extreme they believe the behaviorist philosophies can go. So one other catch when we're talking about responding to this, those of you taking my AP class, it is very important that you use the word reinforcement instead of reward. Something that's an important distinguishment in that, one, there are previous tests where reward would not score you credit, but reinforcement would. In other cases, it can separate that difference between, if I try to reward you for a certain behavior, that doesn't mean the behavior was actually reinforced. And I use the example later where M&Ms make me violently sick. And we'll talk details about like the behaviorist roots of all that types of things. I cannot eat M&Ms, but yet candy is a very common reward. So if I come into a class and someone says, "Oh, good job doing your homework. Here's some M&Ms, eat them now." that won't make my behavior increase anymore. You would say you rewarded me, but yet my behavior will not happen anymore because of what you thought was a reward. And so reinforcement is a much more focused word that says, hey, when this happened, the behavior increased, and it was a measurable increase to do so. So avoid the word. I slip every now and then, and feel free to call me out on it when I do. I know that I've done it at least once already in this video. So be aware that that is an important distinguishment for those of you in my AP class. So let's go to our bear wrestler once again. So when we look at our bear wrestler, I want to remind you, and I put the picture on the screen to help remind you, we do not discuss mental processes. And so as you are wrestling with the behaviorist approach on how to answer this response, do not talk about anything that could be interpreted as a mental process, or the answer will be considered wrong. So once again, I'm going to ask you to pause this video, think about, according to the behaviorist approach, why would he wrestle a grizzly bear? And then unpause when you feel like when you have a good response. All right, so you should have a good response by now on why he is wrestling a grizzly bear. What I want you to check right now, does your response include anything about he thinks, he expects, he wants? If so, you're wrong. Pause the video, try again. And there's hardly any exceptions to that. So the formula we should be following here is you talk about something that has happened in this man's past. So it might not actually be bear wrestling, but it is something that is similar enough in behavior that we could see a similar behavior repeating. So maybe in the past, this man has fought against grizzly bears, and he was reinforced with, fill in whatever reinforcement you want to give. It could have been a hug from someone he cares about. It could have been a big meal. It could have been any random thing, as long as in the future, that's going to make him more likely to wrestle grizzly bears in the future. So you could also talk about how maybe he grew up, and as a little kid, he spent his days wrestling with his dog, and he was reinforced for wrestling with his dog as a little kid, and now he's getting older, so he started wrestling with bigger animals. And so as he continues to go through this, he continues to get reinforced through this. So we can see this if I step back for a second and look at it in a slightly more realistic point of view. We would also use an example like, well, let's say someone became a nurse. So maybe in the past, little 3-year-old kid decided, I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong words there. You caught me, good job. If you didn't, you should hear, I just said decided, and I can't say that. But what we know for sure is maybe this little girl's friend scraped their knee. And so she went in and found a Band-Aid and Band-Aided her friend's knee and got a big hug and a thank you. And then she went home, and her parents told her what a big kid she was and what a good kid she is. And so as she continues through life, when she sees little ways that she can offer medical help, she continues to do that, and she continues to get reinforced until eventually that becomes the career path she's on. And so it can be a small behavior that gets reinforced repeatedly until that becomes just a series of life behaviors that continue to happen. So there's our behaviorist approach. As always, if you are feeling confused or need to check your answer a little more clearly, by all means, reach out. I'm happy to do that with you. And stay tuned and select on our next video for our next psychological approach.